As a massive Souls and general From Software fan, with the excitement and revitalization of the series via the recently announced Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon, I wanted to take a deep dive into the entire series. I had played a bit of the first game, but my overall familiarity was low, so this will be a multi-part video saga covering the different generations of Armored Core. Let's start at the beginning. Armored Core, the first game in the series released in 1997, takes place in a dystopian future that finds what's left of humanity residing in massive underground structures, where corporate warfare and subterfuge is the norm. Mercenaries called Ravens, piloting huge mechs called Armored Cores, carry out missions for them regardless of ideology or morality. The game is essentially a third-person action game with deep customization elements. The main appeal is undoubtedly the very satisfying mech customization. Between missions, you have the opportunity to purchase, sell, and swap out parts in detail for your AC. Your performance in each mission will determine your payout. Damage taken, ammo spent, and the destruction of things you are told to avoid will be taken out of your bottom line, possibly meaning that a mission can actually cost you money if you play poorly enough. You can actually go into the red and have future mission payouts go directly to your debt holders. In order to prevent you from putting yourself into a soft lock situation, you can't sell gear that you need to actually conduct missions while you're in debt. There is a very cool secret that makes the game easier for those deeply in debt, and I'll talk about this later. Depending on the mission, you'll potentially breeze through or struggle based on your setup. You'll have to be aware of weight limits, ammo count, and levels of energy consumption of your parts. Managing this is a bit clunky because in order to do so, you must duck in and out of multiple menu sections to see the numeric comparisons rather than having this stuff all visible simultaneously. It's undoubtedly satisfying to gradually build a powerful mech. There are nice little touches too, like when choosing a part, hearing this awesome little sound of something big and metal snapping into place. One excellent and forward-thinking feature is that any purchased gear does not lose value upon resale, meaning that you can endlessly experiment with different parts and not lose cash while doing so. The core gameplay loop is basically choosing a mission, tweaking your AC to best suit it based on the mission parameters, tackling the mission itself, and further customizing your AC based on how the mission went. This is also an opportunity to check your in-game email, which provides both world building and about 50% of the developments in the story. As you're making your way through any given mission, you're also thinking up ways to improve your AC, change things that you maybe wish were a little faster or a little more durable, etc. It's addictive. The mechs themselves were designed by Shoji Kawamori, who is responsible for creating the influential Macross series, as well as the Diaclone series of toys, which led to the creation of Robotech and Transformers. When the design for Armored Core was requested to me, it was before the original PlayStation was launched. There were quite a lot of unknowns and there were ideas for separate parts, such as arms, feet, and weapons, and so on. These then had to be combined by the player on their own. However, if you allow a player to create their own mecha, it makes it very hard to give it a sense of visual identity, such as clearly differentiating from other mecha anime and games. I also thought that other games would follow suit when this was released. As I believe that this idea should differentiate this game from the rest of its competition, I proposed the concept of the Armored Cores, meaning that the core block with cockpit and engine as well as the joint connectors for the head, arm, legs, and weapons and so on. They adopted the proposal and called it Armored Core as a consequence. There are a variety of missions to choose from and quite a few of them are optional. These have a pretty broad variety of objectives and settings, ranging from simple stuff like just destroy everything, to protecting VIPs, and navigating maze-like bases. Secret, powerful AC parts can also be found if you go out of your way to explore a bit. The central conflict in the game revolves around the two most powerful corporations, Chrome and Murakumo, and the ending route you end up with is based on which you accept more assignments from. Your communications with them and other characters occur almost entirely via the email messages received between missions. These were effective at world building this kind of cyberpunk society, despite how little you actually see of it outside of the missions. Overall, I personally found the missions in the first half of the game to be a little bit more enjoyable. Many of the later assignments take place in repetitive maze-like environments that didn't quite gel with the controls as well. Turning in the PS1 AC titles is quite slow regardless of your build, and your AC has a tendency to get caught up in corners and the edges of walls quite easily, and this kind of level design exacerbates those issues. Another factor is that many many of the stages in the back half lack music. This can sometimes create tense atmospheres, which are occasionally spiced up by ambient or environmental sound effects, but most of the time they just felt kind of empty for me. The controls are basically what you would expect from an older PS1 game. There is no analog support for looking around, so you get that classic old-school combination of the directional buttons used to move vertically and for turning horizontally, with L2 and R2 designed for looking up and down. This is definitely a bit hard to get used to and a bit unwieldy even afterwards, but for the most part, the pacing of the gameplay and the level design usually is accommodating in this regard. If you're playing on an emulator, you can rebind the controls to resemble a more modern setup, but I wouldn't recommend it because the total lack of granularity in the movement and the camera controls doesn't translate well to the analog sticks. There's a fairly generous lock-on system that has a satisfying pace and click for the weapons that support it. This weapon also ties into the mech customization system in that you can upgrade your targeting system to be faster, support a higher number of simultaneous lock-on weapons for things like missiles that fire multiple projectiles at the same time. There are also different styles of lock-on, from wide and shallow to narrow and deep. I'm telling you, the customization really is crazy in this game. The overall pace of gameplay feels convincing considering that you're operating this massive hunk of machinery, and the speed and sound effects help sell the weight of these things. Developing your AC towards your preferred playstyle in turn influences elements of control, such as the way your weapons handle, energy consumption use, stun time on impacts, weight and boosters determining hang time in the air, legs determining your base movement speed and turning speed. It's good. I really enjoyed the music of Armored Core. It was composed and produced by Kichiro Sagawa and Masaru Tateyama. It's appropriately a totally electronic, high-energy soundtrack with elements of 90s acid techno, breakbeat, and house. If you're a fan of classic 90s warp records and similar music, you'll like this. Not only are the tracks well done and enjoyable to listen to on their own, but in-game, the pacing of them gels really well with the gameplay. The sound effects are mostly good, with what you would expect for gunfire, explosions, and the whine of the boost engines of the AC. The menu noises are perfect cyberpunk sci-fi type stuff. Those are all solid. However, a massive issue with the sound is the super loud volume of the voice acting in the game.
System engaged.
The performances are fine, but the voices are mixed at least several decibels higher than anything else in the game. To make sure that this wasn't just an emulator problem, I went back and played the game on original hardware as well as checking out other people's playthroughs on YouTube. Unfortunately, it really is mixed like that. This meant that if I wanted to play the game at a nice loud volume and enjoy the music and the other sound effects, I had to either be ready to dive for the volume knob every time a chat box opened, or just endure the ear-piercingly loud voiceover. I suppose you could also utilize some kind of audio limiter solution as well. I wanted to see if this was a localization issue, and based on some brief testing I did, it seems as though the original Japanese voiceover has the same issue, perhaps not quite as bad.
システム起動
The graphics in Armored Core 1 are about what you'd expect for a game released in 1997 for the PlayStation. The mechs look great, and the environments have a reasonable level of detail, and effects are impressive, with some cool colored lighting effects going on with the explosions and other weaponry. The stages can look a little basic, but most still manage to have a compelling look. 2D elements like the menu screen and your AC's heads-up display are appropriately futuristic and punchy. Performance-wise, the game maintains a consistent 22 frames per second in-game and up to 40 FPS in menus. Definitely low by modern standards, but playable. Armored Core and all of its sequels do support multiplayer, both via split screen and system link. You can load your builds from a memory card, so you and a friend can put your ACs head-to-head. You'll find several references to other From Software franchises within these games, as they are so apt to do. The best blade weapon in the game is the Moonlight, based of course on the Moonlight Greatsword, a recurring weapon in many of their titles originating from Kingsfield. One unusual example that is probably a coincidence is the mission where you have to stop the gang Dark Soul. Playing Armored Core, it's easy to see how it went on to become an enduring series. Overall, I really enjoyed it, and I wish I had played it sooner. It's a nice balance of action, resource management, and simulation elements. The next game in the AC series soon followed. Armored Core Project Phantasma was released only 5 months after the first game in Japan and about a year later in America. It was not released in PAL regions. It is basically an expansion pack, the kind of thing we used to see regularly on PC, but definitely a bit of an oddity for a PlayStation 1 release. The gameplay, graphics, menus, and even the majority of the music is exactly the same. There has been a bit of rebalancing for some of the parts and new ones added, but the game is basically otherwise mostly identical. One major difference is that there are 17 new missions compared to the first game's 50, and unfortunately little choice in which ones to accept. The storyline and world of the game is also less interesting than the first, with a fairly straightforward plot that has you working with your partner Sumika against the Doomsday Organization. In the Japanese original, they're called the Wednesday Agency. Go figure. Regardless of the name, I found the clear-cut good versus evil structure of the missions in this game to be less interesting than the morally ambiguous cutthroat mercenaries and corporate warfare scenarios of the original game. The missions themselves feature a wider variety of objectives than the first game, but in terms of overall quality level, they're about the same. I think the first game maybe had higher highs, but also lower lows. Things like the poison gas level from the first game come to mind. There are still some maze-like stages, but not quite as frequently as the back half of AC1. One noticeable difference is the massively increased usage of real-time cutscenes within the stages. None of these are very long or very dynamic, but it's a neat addition nonetheless. Some of the stages still feature those moments of weird scale and level design, such as the ending of this mission in which you and another AC escape in what looks like a standard cargo airplane. Again, these things are supposed to be the size of buildings, but it's all good. To compensate for the much smaller amount of missions here, From Software introduces what will become a major staple of the AC series, the Arena mode. This portion of the game has you climbing a ranking ladder against 49 unique ACs, starting with you on the bottom, earning both cash and parts if you win. There's some world building and neat characterization here, as not only does each opponent have a unique AC build, but a little backstory and description as well. You also get a choice of a surprisingly large amount of arenas to fight in, a few of which are returning maps from AC1. A replay can be watched after the match, which can be fun or even useful if you want to see how you just got destroyed. You can choose between the standard player POV, or one from the enemies, and a semi-dynamic one that shows the action from an overhead perspective. One unfortunate aspect of this is that the game automatically loads the replay if you win the match, which means waiting through an extra loading screen if you just want to move forward. In another first for the series, you can import your data from the previous game, giving you a massive head start and overall decrease in difficulty. You get to import your AC build, all of your parts, and cash. This also allows you to utilize some weapons and parts, and that secret I mentioned earlier, that are otherwise unattainable within Project Phantasma. There's really not much else to say about Project Phantasma. It really is extremely similar to its predecessor. Other than the arena mode, the thing that stood out to me the most was the final battle. Skip to the timestamp on screen if you don't want to be spoiled. Mechanically, it differs from every other encounter from either game prior to this point, in that it moves through specific phases that must be handled in specific ways. Visually, not only does the arena look nice, but it has this genuinely great looking massive laser attack that left me impressed. A fun final encounter and a definite highlight of the game. To wrap it up for Project Phantasma, if you liked AC1, it's worth checking out. I wouldn't call it essential, and I think the overall quality level is a bit lower than the first game, but it's still a solid, if brief, experience. Armored Core Master of Arena is the final installment on the PS1, and it's kind of a hybrid of the structure of the previous titles. The plot in this one has you playing as a character who is seeking revenge on the Raven known as Nineball, who is responsible for the death of his family, presumably as collateral damage via some kind of mission assignment. The player character decides to enlist as a Raven, an AC pilot, in order to track down Nineball and get revenge. Based on that concept, you may be expecting some kind of commentary on the cycles of revenge, but the game doesn't really explore that. You work your way up the ladder in a pretty straightforward way, doing some jobs to gain respect and credibility, and eventually a corporate sponsorship in order to gain access to the arena, and eventually Nineball. There are some twists and turns towards the end, but nothing too mind-blowing. It's another style of story in the same setting and time period as the other two games. First we had morally gray corporate warfare, then we had a straightforward good versus evil plot, and now Revenge. Personally, I still think the first game out of the PS1 trilogy remains the most interesting in terms of concept and how your actions are influencing the world, leading to different stages and endings, but Master of Arena has some novelty and cool elements to it as well. Nineball is a decent antagonist, and I found his introduction at the end of the first mission to be very amusing.
Nineball? What's a top-ranked Arena AC doing here?
I heard you've been looking for me.
One big difference with this title is how the campaign is essentially interwoven between the mission assignments and the arena fights. Your mandatory route through the game essentially weaves in and out of both, justifying that core story concept, providing more world building, and giving a more unique game structure compared to the previous two titles. You have some choice in mission selection in the first half of the game, but once you are granted access to the arena, the 1v1 fights there make up the bulk of the rest of the game, with the occasional regular mission thrown back in. Tsukasa Saito and Kaichiro Sagawa again returned for a mostly new set of music, now with Kota Hoshino joining them. Hoshino would become a regular fixture of Armored Core, becoming its most consistently contributing musician. The OST as a whole is very much of the same style as the previous games, but Hoshino's compositions seem to more frequently lean in the direction of melancholy, which is something that would become more and more prominent as the series goes on. As you might imagine from the name of the game, the arena mode was a large focus of this installment. There are tons of opponents, again each with their own unique build and backstory, but they also seem to have unique AI routines, leading to a pretty large diversity in how the encounters play out. There's also a bonus EX Arena mode that is packaged on a second disc featuring many more opponents, most notably winners of Project Phantasma tournaments in Japan, From Software employees, and staff from the Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu, which from what I understand had maintained ongoing coverage and AC builds submitted by readers from the series. Master of Arena again lets you import save data either from Project Phantasma or the original Armored Core, and I'd say it's almost mandatory for this one considering the jump in difficulty. It is easily the toughest game out of the PS1 trilogy, especially considering the ruthless arena opponents. Starting with this title is not recommended. So that secret I mentioned a few times now, it's called Human Plus, and it is basically a gradual difficulty shift that the player can utilize. You can activate Human Plus in the first Armored Core by going 50,000 credits in debt. You'll then immediately get a cutscene of your character undergoing a mandatory experimental procedure, presumably against their will due to the level of debt they've accrued.
Seems to have piled up quite a debt.
Must have dashed his dreams. But he will be reborn in this experiment.
That is, if he lives.
You have a point there. Let's get started.
When this happens, your mission progress and credits will reset as though you had begun a new game, but your name will be changed to Rebel with a random 3-digit number attached. The first time you do this, you'll be given a built-in radar and a blade beam. Continue to do this, and you'll gain the ability to use the back weapons, such as Gatling guns, without having to kneel when you use them, which is extremely useful. Further cycles include increasing your energy efficiency by 50%. As you can imagine, this makes the game quite a bit easier. Well, why do I only bring it up now? Because most of the top-ranked arena opponents in this game are utilizing the Human Plus upgrades. If you aren't using them too, you are at an inherent disadvantage that isn't going to be necessarily readily apparent. Your opponents are literally using performance enhancers. What will you do? To make things even more difficult, accessing Human Plus is only available in Armored Core 1, meaning that if you want to use it, you need to activate it there and then import that data into either Project Phantasma or Master of Arena. I do have to say that it is thematically appropriate for the setting. That being said, it is entirely possible to complete any of these games in which Human Plus is a factor without having to utilize it yourself, and victory, without resorting to performance enhancers, may taste all the sweeter. That concludes the original PlayStation trilogy of Armored Core. I enjoyed my time with them, and I definitely see myself playing through them again at some point. They are brief enough where playing them back to back is about 15 to 20 hours, or the length of your average game in total, and the ability to continue to develop your AC by importing your data from game to game increases the possibilities and fun factor. I'd recommend starting with the original to anyone curious about the series, as long as you can handle the old school digital PlayStation controls. Legally getting your hands on these games may prove difficult, thanks to a lack of digital availability on on modern platforms, and scumbag scalpers on eBay who have unfortunately jacked the prices way up since the announcement of Armored Core 6. Hopefully these prices go back down at some point, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Fortunately, they are easily emulated. I would recommend DuckStation, as I would for any other emulation of PlayStation 1 titles. That's how I've gotten all the footage you've seen so far. With it, the games run close to flawlessly, have fully customizable controls, lots of visual options including texture perspective correction. That means none of that PlayStation texture warping. You've also got resolution upscaling and CRT filters, and even proper widescreen hacks. One issue with the widescreen hacks for these games is that the menus don't draw correctly while using it, but once you're in-game with the missions, everything works fine. What I would suggest doing is setting a hotkey for toggling between the widescreen and 4x3 mode and switch between them whenever you're in the menus of the Raven's Nest. I can also vouch for the games running perfectly via the X-Station ODE if you want to play on original hardware. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through the series. In the next part of this series, we'll be entering the PlayStation 2 era with Armored Core 2 and Armored Core 2 Another Age, and I hope you'll join me. See you next time.